You will be assimilated, she'd said, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine condescension that only a true believer in their own petty authority can muster. Resistance is not only futile, it's expensive. That was Brenda Frum, president, founder, and supreme commander of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association. And that was the line that turned a simple property line dispute into my own private, meticulously engineered war. If you're a fan of watching a house of cards get knocked over by a hurricane of its own making, stick around. You're going to love this story. What would you do if someone tried to steal your home out from under you, one ridiculous fine at a time? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. This all started because I wanted peace. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away 6 months prior after a long, brutal fight with cancer. Our life together had been in a bustling city, full of noise and ambition and the shared dream of one day retiring to a quiet little spot in the country. She never made it. So, I decided to make it for her. I sold our city home, packed up 30 years of memories, and moved into the house my own father had built with his 2 hands, a small, sturdy brick ranch on a half-acre lot at the end of a quiet road called Willow Lane. It was supposed to be a place to grieve, to heal, and to finally build the elaborate garden Eleanor had designed in stacks of notebooks. It was a legacy project. My final promise to her. I hadn't counted on a homeowners association, much less one run by a woman who seemed to model her leadership style on a medieval warlord. I soon learned that Brenda Frum and her Creekwood Estates HOA had been slowly annexing the soul of our once peaceful corner of the county, and she had just declared my little slice of heaven her next conquest. She was about to find out that while I may look like a quiet, grieving widower, my entire professional life had been spent drawing lines, on maps, on land, and in the sand. And she had just stomped all over the most important one I had. The house was my sanctuary. My father, a master carpenter and stonemason, had built it in 1983. It was simple, honest, and solid as the granite bedrock it sat on. It was one of only 5 houses on Willow Lane, a small pocket of properties that predated the sprawling, beige-sided behemoth that was Creekwood Estates. We were, for all intents and purposes, an island of old-school character in a sea of monotonous conformity. I spent the first few weeks just settling in, unpacking boxes that felt both too full and too empty. Eleanor's scent still clung to her sweaters, and her half-finished crossword puzzles were still tucked into her favorite books. Every object was a landmine of memory. The work was slow, painful, and necessary. My focus, my therapy, was the garden. I had her sketches, her notes on soil acidity, her lists of heirloom roses and climbing jasmine. The patch of lawn out back was my canvas, and bringing her vision to life was my mission. I was a civil engineer by trade, specializing in land surveying and municipal planning. My world was one of precise measurements, legal boundaries, and the unyielding logic of statutes and codes. I found a certain comfort in the order of it all. It was a welcome contrast to the chaos of grief. My first encounter with Brenda Frum happened on a Tuesday. I was out front, replacing the old, rusted mailbox my dad had installed 40 years ago with a new, simple black one. A gleaming white SUV, the size of a small tank, pulled up to my curb. A woman with a helmet of blonde hair, sunglasses that could double as a welder's mask, and a clipboard emerged. She strode onto my lawn as if she owned it. "Good morning," she announced, her voice a little too loud for the quiet street. "I'm Brenda Frum, president of the Creekwood Estates HOA. "Mark Ryder," I said, offering a hand she ignored. "Nice to meet you." "I'm sure it is," she said, her eyes scanning my property with a look of profound disapproval. "I just wanted to drop this off. It's a welcome packet. And a preliminary notice of violation." She thrust the clipboard at me. Attached was a sheaf of papers. On top was a brightly colored brochure for Creekwood Estates, featuring smiling, suspiciously perfect families. Beneath it was a formal-looking letter. I scanned it. Violation, unapproved mailbox installation. Fine, $50. I felt a small, incredulous laugh escape my lips. A violation. I just put it in the ground. "All exterior modifications must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee," she recited, as if reading from a sacred text. "The approved mailbox is the Charleston Classic, in Hunter Green, available through our designated supplier. It's all in the covenants." I handed the clipboard back to her. "I think there's been a mistake," I said politely. My property isn't part of Creekwood Estates. A tight, unpleasant smile stretched her lips. Oh, that's a common misconception among the residents of the Willow Lane Annex. Your properties were absorbed into the association's jurisdiction last year. It's for the good of the community. Maintaining property values, you know. I knew for a fact this wasn't true. I had done a title search and reviewed the property records before finalizing the purchase. My deed made no mention of an HOA. My property was an island, legally and physically. I'm quite sure it's not, I said, my tone still even. My subdivision, the original 5 lots on this lane, was platted and recorded long before Creekwood was ever conceived. We're not an annex, we're just your neighbors. Her smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. It was a shockingly fast transition. I have the paperwork, Mr. Ryder. You are part of this community, and you will abide by its rules. Pay the fine, replace the mailbox, and I suggest you read those covenants very, very carefully. The next fine is double. She spun on her heel, marched back to her urban assault vehicle, and sped away. I stood there for a long moment, the brand new, perfectly reasonable black mailbox seeming to mock me. It was absurd. It was laughable. But as I looked at the crisp, official-looking violation notice she'd left on my driveway, a cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't a mistake. This was a declaration of intent. My quiet little sanctuary had just been invaded. The initial conflict, petty as it was, had begun. Brenda had drawn a line, and she'd drawn it right through the middle of my front yard. My first instinct was to simply ignore her. What could she do? She had no legal authority. I was a man who understood jurisdiction, and she was a woman operating purely on bluff and bluster. Or so I thought. A week later, another envelope appeared in my new, non-compliant mailbox. It was from the Creekwood Estates HOA Office of Compliance. Inside was a second notice. The fine for the mailbox was now $100. There was a new violation listed as well: unkempt lawn appearance, presence of non-ornamental vegetation. The fine for that was another $50. I looked out at my backyard. I had spent the week tilling a large patch of earth for Eleanor's garden. I had laid out the beds with string and stakes, following her designs to the millimeter. To Brenda, this was non-ornamental vegetation. To me, it was sacred ground. The letter stated that all landscaping plans had to be submitted for approval. Vegetable gardens were expressly forbidden, as they detracted from the cohesive aesthetic of the community. This was no longer just absurd. It was insulting. I wrote a polite, concise letter in response. I cited the public record of my property's deed, the plat number of the Willow Lane subdivision, and the corresponding county statutes that clearly delineated my property as being outside the legal boundaries of the Creekwood Estates HOA. I made 2 copies, kept one, and sent the original via certified mail. In my world, a certified letter was a serious thing. It created a paper trail. It meant business. Apparently, in Brenda's world, it was a challenge. Her response was not a letter. It was an escalation. A few days later, I found a bright orange sticker slapped on my front door. It was a final notice of violation in a huge, aggressive font. It listed the mailbox, the garden, and a new infraction, failure to respond to association correspondence. The total fines were now listed at $500, with a threat of a lien being placed on my property if not paid within 10 days. She was actually trying to file a lien. The audacity was breathtaking. A lien could cloud my title and cause serious financial and legal headaches. It was a baseless threat. Of course, she couldn't legally file a lien on a property over which she had no authority, but the average person wouldn't know that. It was a tactic of pure intimidation, designed to scare people into compliance. It was bullying, plain and simple. Then, she went public. I logged into the town's community Facebook page to look for a local nursery and saw a post from Brenda from. It was a thinly veiled warning about new residents in the greater Creekwood area who refused to contribute to the community's beauty and standards. She wrote about freeloaders who benefited from the high property values the HOA maintained without following the rules that made it all possible. She didn't use my name, but she mentioned a house on Willow Lane with an illegal black mailbox and a disastrous dirt patch in the yard. The comments section was a mix of support from her sycophants and a few cautious questions from others. My quiet, private battle was now a public spectacle. I felt a slow burn of anger rising in my chest. This woman wasn't just mistaken, she was malicious. She was using public shaming and illegal threats to try and force me into a contract I had never signed, for a community I didn't belong to. My peace was being systematically dismantled. But the real turning point, the moment my patient, methodical nature snapped and reformed into something cold and sharp, came that Saturday. I had spent the morning carefully planting the first of Eleanor's heirloom rose bushes. These weren't just any roses. I had ordered them from a specialty grower in Oregon she had bookmarked on her computer. They were expensive, delicate, and they were the cornerstone of her entire garden design. I had followed her instructions perfectly, amending the soil, checking the drainage, and placing them exactly where the morning sun would hit them best. I finished around noon, my back aching but my heart feeling a little lighter for the first time in months. I went inside to clean up and have some lunch. When I came back out an hour later, they were gone. Not just gone. Ripped out of the ground. The soil was disturbed, the roots torn. Lying in the middle of the freshly tilled dirt was a single, pristine white envelope. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Inside was a note printed on Creekwood Estates letterhead. Per Article 4, Section 2 of the Covenants, all plantings must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Unapproved vegetation has been removed. Please submit a formal landscaping plan for consideration. A $200 fine for the cost of removal has been added to your account. I stood there, staring at the empty holes in the ground where Eleanor's roses had been. They hadn't just removed them. They had trespassed. They had destroyed my property. They had desecrated a memorial to my wife. That was it. The line had been crossed. The grieving widower was gone, and the civil engineer took his place. My grief, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, now felt like it was being forged into a weapon. Brenda thought this was a battle of wills, of rules, and fines. She had no idea. I wasn't going to fight her on her terms anymore. I was going to bring the fight to my world. The world of surveys, and plats, and legal descriptions. A world of hard lines and absolute truths. I went inside, sat down at my drafting table, and began to draw up the plans. Not for a garden, but for the complete and total dismantling of Brenda's little empire. The turning point wasn't a decision, it was a chemical reaction. She had pushed too far. She had introduced an unacceptable level of chaos into my ordered world. And I was going to restore order. My first move was to retreat into what I knew best, research. The anger was a roaring fire, but I knew I couldn't act on it. Fire is chaotic. I needed precision. I needed the cold, hard, undeniable truth of public records. On Monday morning, instead of heading to the nursery to replace the destroyed rose bushes, I drove to the county records office. The building was old and smelled of aging paper and dust, a scent I found strangely comforting. It was the smell of history, of facts set in stone and ink. I knew the clerk of courts, a man named George, from my years of filing plats and deeds for municipal projects. He was a stickler for details, a man who believed in the sanctity of a properly recorded document. "Mark," he said, peering over his reading glasses. "Haven't seen you in a while. Sorry to hear about Eleanor. She was a fine woman." "Thanks, George." "She was. What can I do for you?" "Don't tell me you're getting back into the game already." "Something like that," I said. "I need to pull some records. Everything you have on the Creekwood Estates development. Incorporation papers, bylaws, all recorded plats, amendments, everything. And I need the original plat map for the Willow Lane subdivision, recorded back in the early 80s. George raised an eyebrow. "Creekwood? Having trouble with the queen bee, are you?" It seemed Brenda's reputation preceded her. "You could say that. She seems to believe my property is part of her kingdom." George let out a dry chuckle. "That woman would try to annex the courthouse if she thought she could get away with it. Let me see what I can dig up." He returned a while later with a heavy, wheeled cart piled high with thick binders and rolled-up plat maps. It was a mountain of paper, and I spent the rest of the day sifting through it. I started with the easy part, confirming what I already knew. I unrolled the original Mylar plat for Willow Lane, dated 1983. There it was, clear as day. 5 lots, each precisely surveyed, with meets and bounds descriptions tying them to established county monuments. My father's signature was on the original deed. It was a self-contained, legally distinct entity. Next, I unrolled the master plat for Creekwood Estates, Phase 1, dated 1994. It was a sprawling, amoeba-like development that wrapped around our little cul-de-sac. I traced its boundaries with my finger. The line was clear. The Creekwood plat abutted the Willow Lane plat, but it did not, in any way, overlap or include it. Legally, we were two separate countries sharing a border. Her claim of an annexation was a complete fabrication. There was no recorded document, no amendment, no vote that would have legally allowed such a thing. It simply didn't exist. That was my shield. Now, I needed a sword. I turned to the HOA's incorporation documents and bylaws. It was a dense, turgid sea of legalese, but I waded through it, page by mind-numbing page. I was looking for weakness, for corners cut, for any sign of impropriety. And then I found it. It was a small detail, something most people would overlook. The HOA's Articles of Incorporation granted them the authority to manage the common areas and enforce the covenants within the boundaries described in the recorded master plat. The document was explicit. Their power ended where their property line ended. But then I found something even better. I started cross-referencing the list of HOA board members with other public records, property transactions, business licenses, court filings. Brenda From's name appeared frequently. But so did another name, From Landscaping, LLC. A quick search of the state's business registry showed the sole proprietor of From Landscaping was one Daniel From, Brenda's brother-in-law. I went back to the HOA's annual budgets, which had been filed, as required by state law, with the county. For the past 5 years, the line item for common area maintenance and landscaping had ballooned. The vendor listed for all of those contracts. From Landscaping, LLC. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a clear conflict of interest, and likely a violation of the HOA's own bylaws regarding non-competitive bidding and self-dealing. But the real bombshell was hidden in the county's property lien records. I searched for liens filed by the Creekwood Estates HOA. There were dozens over the years. Most were for unpaid dues, and most were legitimate. But I noticed a pattern in the last 3 years. 4 properties had been foreclosed on by the HOA. In each case, the process started with a series of rapidly escalating fines for minor, subjective violations, things like improper lawn height or faded exterior paint. The homeowners, all of whom were elderly, were hit with thousands of dollars in fines, legal fees, and finally, a lien. Unable to pay, the HOA foreclosed. And who bought all 4 of those properties at the subsequent foreclosure auction, often for pennies on the dollar? Not the HOA itself. A different LLC, this one called Creekwood Development Partners. I almost fell out of my chair when I looked up the registered agent for that company. It was Brenda From's husband. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a power-hungry woman on a neighborhood power trip. This was a systematic, predatory scheme. She was using the HOA as a weapon to harass and intimidate residents, manufacture debt through bogus fines, and then seize their homes for her family's financial gain. My illegal mailbox wasn't a random act of tyranny. It was the first step in their playbook. She wasn't trying to get me to join her HOA. She was trying to get me out of my house. The investigation had uncovered a weakness, all right. It had uncovered a criminal conspiracy. The foundation of her house of cards wasn't just faulty, it was rotten to the core. I had my sword. Now I just needed to sharpen it. I spent hours at the copy machine, meticulously duplicating every plat, every page of the bylaws, every budget, every lien, every property transfer record. I walked out of the records office that evening with a banker's box heavy with evidence. The game had changed. This was no longer about defending my little half-acre. It was about liberating an entire community. The drive home was a blur. My mind, trained to see the world in grids, lines, and logical progressions, was now assembling a different kind of plan. It wasn't a site plan for a new development, it was a battle plan. Every piece of evidence I had uncovered was a weapon, and every action I took from this point forward had to be precise, deliberate, and devastating. Brenda thought she was playing checkers. I was about to set up a chessboard. The first phase of my plan was simple: documentation and bait. I needed to move from a position of defense to one of offense, but I had to do it in a way that would make her incriminate herself further. I needed her overconfidence to become my greatest asset. I went to an electronics store and bought 3 small, high-definition security cameras. They were discreet, motion-activated, and could upload footage directly to a secure cloud server. I spent an evening carefully installing them. One was hidden in a birdhouse, aimed at my front door and driveway. Another was disguised as a landscape light, covering the new garden beds. The third was inside, looking out the front window, providing a wider, contextual view. Every interaction, every trespass, would now be captured. Next, I crafted my bait. It was a new letter, addressed to Brenda from the Creekwood Estates HOA Board of Directors. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. The letter was a masterpiece of polite, professional, and legally loaded language. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply stated the facts I had uncovered. Dear Ms. From and members of the board, it began. Pursuant to my review of public records held at the county courthouse, including Plat Book 14, page 82, Willow Lane Subdivision, Rec. 1983, and Plat Book 35, page 112, Creekwood Estates, Phase 1, Rec. 1994, it is a matter of legal fact that my property, parcel ID #78-23-11, is not and has never been subject to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association. Therefore, all fines, notices, and threats of lien issued by your association are legally void and without merit. That was the shield. Then came the bait, disguised as a helpful suggestion. Furthermore, my review of the association's publicly filed financial statements has identified potential conflicts of interest regarding vendor contracts that may place the board in violation of its own bylaws and its fiduciary duty to its members. Specifically, the contracts awarded to From Landscaping, LLC. I trust that you will want to look into this matter immediately to ensure full compliance and transparency for the homeowners you represent. I consider this matter closed and expect no further contact from you or your representatives. Any further attempts to harass me, trespass on my property, or cloud my property title will be met with immediate and appropriate legal action. I signed it, sealed it, and sent it on its way. The trap was set. I had presented her with an off-ramp. A reasonable person would see the evidence, recognize the legal exposure, and back off. But I was betting that Brenda From was not a reasonable person. I was betting that her arrogance would not allow her to admit a mistake, especially not when I had hinted at her dirty little secret. I was betting she would double down. And I was right. 3 days later, the certified mail receipt came back with her angry, jagged signature on it. The following morning, her white SUV screeched to a halt at my curb. The little red light on my birdhouse camera blinked on. She stormed up my driveway, a man I didn't recognize trailing behind her. He was big, with a scowl and a From Landscaping logo on his polo shirt. I recognized him from the LLC filing, Daniel From, her brother-in-law. I met them at the door, stepping out onto the porch to ensure the camera had a clear view. Mr. Ryder, she shrieked, waving my letter in her hand like a weapon. How dare you? How dare you threaten me with these lies? Brenda, I said, my voice calm and low. There are no lies in that letter. Only facts from the public record. I've asked you to leave my property and cease all contact. I suggest you do so. This is my property, she spat, her face turning a blotchy red. Or at least, it's my jurisdiction. Your little maps don't mean anything. We provide services. We maintain the roads. You benefit, so you will pay. The county maintains this road, Brenda. It's a public right-of-way. You know that. Her eyes narrowed into slits. You think you're so smart, with your little letters. Well, let's see how smart you are when your life is a living hell. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she turned to her brother-in-law. Daniel, the violation notice said the unapproved vegetation was to be removed. It looks like he started to replant. Take care of it. My blood turned to ice. She was ordering him to destroy my property, right here on camera. It was a gift. A beautiful, damning gift. Daniel, I said, looking past her directly at the men. I'm advising you not to set foot on my property. That would be criminal trespass and destruction of property. This entire conversation is being recorded. Daniel hesitated, looking from me to Brenda. He was the muscle, but he clearly wasn't the brains. Don't listen to him. Brenda snapped. Do what I said. But the mention of a recording had spooked him. He shook his head. I'm not getting arrested for some bushes, Bren. This is crazy. He retreated to the SUV. Brenda shot him a look of pure venom before turning back to me. Her rage was incandescent. This isn't over, she hissed. I'm going to own this house. You'll be begging to leave by the time I'm done with you. She stormed off, and I watched her SUV peel away from the curb. I went inside and immediately downloaded the video file. The audio was crystal clear. Her threats, her admission of sending someone to destroy my property, her utter disregard for the law, it was all there. The first part of the trap had sprung perfectly. She had taken the bait and, in her rage, had incriminated herself beautifully. Now, it was time for the first public reveal. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. The notice, posted on the community bulletin board at the entrance to Creekwood Estates, announced an agenda that included budget approvals and a special assessment for legal fees. I knew that last item was meant for me. It was her way of telling the community that she was using their money to come after me. I decided it was the perfect venue to plant the first seeds of doubt among her subjects. I arrived at the community clubhouse a few minutes early. It was a sterile, beige room filled with uncomfortable folding chairs. About 30 homeowners were present, most looking bored and resigned, as if this were a necessary evil. Brenda and her two bored cronies, a sour-faced woman named Carol and a meek-looking man named Bob, sat at a long table at the front. When Brenda saw me walk in, her face tightened. She stood up abruptly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "This is a private meeting for members of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association only." All eyes turned to me. I gave a polite, neighborly smile. "Good evening, Brenda. I'm not here as a member. I'm here as a concerned citizen. And since you've listed legal fees related to my property on your public agenda, I believe I have a right to be heard." "You have no rights here," she snapped. "This is private property. I'm asking you to leave." "Actually," I said, pulling a folded document from my jacket pocket, "according to the clubhouse's articles of use, filed with the county, any meeting discussing assessments is open to any affected party." "You could argue I'm an affected party, couldn't you?" I held up the document. It was a bluff. I hadn't checked the clubhouse rules, but it was delivered with the confidence of a man who had. She was momentarily thrown off balance. Before she could recover, a man in the back row spoke up. "Let him speak, Brenda. If we're paying legal fees to sue him, I'd like to hear what this is all about." A few other people murmured in agreement. Trapped, Brenda reluctantly gestured to a chair. "Fine. But you will be silent until the open forum at the end of the meeting." I sat through an hour of mind-numbing discussion about pet waste and holiday decoration regulations. Finally, Brenda arrived at the special assessment. "As many of you know," she began, shooting a glare in my direction, "the association has been forced to retain legal counsel to deal with a non-compliant homeowner on the Willow Lane Annex who is refusing to pay his dues and fines, creating a financial burden on all of us." She was painting me as a deadbeat, a freeloader. It was time. "Point of information, Madam President," I said, standing up. I didn't wait for her permission. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a large, rolled-up tube. "You are out of order," she screeched. "I believe the homeowners deserve to see what their special assessment is paying for," I said calmly. I unrolled the tube on an empty easel next to her. It was a large, color-printed copy of the two subdivision plats, side by side. I had highlighted the boundary lines in bright yellow. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the room. "My name is Mark Ryder. I live at the end of Willow Lane. This document on the left is the legally recorded plat for my 5-home subdivision, filed in 1983. This one on the right is the plat for Creekwood Estates, filed in 1994. As you can clearly see, from a legal standpoint that is not up for debate, Willow Lane is not, and has never been, a part of Creekwood Estates. We are separate entities." I let that sink in. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. "Your president, Ms. Frum, has been illegally fining me, harassing me, and threatening to place a fraudulent lien on my home. She has trespassed on my property and destroyed my personal belongings. She is now asking you, the actual members of this HOA, to pay her legal bills for a fight she has no legal authority to wage. Brenda's face was a mask of pure fury. He's lying. It's a trick. The annexation documents were filed. Then I invite you to produce them, I said, turning to face her. Please, show us all the legally recorded document that proves you have any jurisdiction over my property. I'll wait. The room was silent. Everyone looked at Brenda. She sputtered, her eyes darting around wildly. They're with our lawyer. This is a procedural matter. He's trying to confuse you with technicalities. But the damage was done. I had presented clear, visual, undeniable evidence. She had responded with blustering and rage. For the first time, the residents of Creekwood Estates were seeing a crack in their queen's armor. They saw a man calmly presenting facts, and a woman hysterically denying them. You will not pay a dime of your hard-earned money to harass me, I said to the room. Because this special assessment is a fraud, just like her authority over my home is a fraud. Brenda completely lost her composure. Get out, she screamed, her voice cracking. Get out of my meeting. You're trespassing. I'll be happy to, I said, rolling up my maps. I think I've made my point. As I walked out, I could hear the room erupt into chaos behind me. Questions were being shouted. Demands for proof were being made. I hadn't won the war, not even close. But I had won a major battle. I had shown the people that their empress had no clothes. And I had pushed her into a corner. I knew her reaction wouldn't be to retreat. It would be to escalate. And her vicious retaliation was exactly what I needed for the final phase of my plan. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and predictable. Brenda, from publicly humiliated and her authority questioned for the first time, did not back down. She went on the attack with a ferocity that bordered on unhinged. She was a cornered animal, and she was lashing out with everything she had. Her first move was to plaster the community social media page with a doctored narrative. She claimed I was a disruptive and dangerous individual who had stormed the meeting to intimidate the board. She accused me of being a professional conman trying to use legal loopholes to avoid my community obligations. It was a classic smear campaign, full of ad hominem attacks and outright lies. Then, the official harassment began. An inspector from the county's code enforcement office showed up at my door. He had an anonymous complaint that I was running an illegal commercial engineering firm out of my home. I invited him in, showed him my small home office, a desk, a computer, and a drafting table, and explained that I was semi-retired and did occasional consulting work, which was perfectly legal under residential zoning. The inspector was apologetic and left, but I knew who had made the call. A few days later, a van from animal control pulled into my driveway. They had received a call, again anonymous, claiming I was neglecting a dog, that it was left outside in all weather and its barking was a constant nuisance. The problem, of course, was that I didn't own a dog. The officer looked around my quiet, pet-free property, sighed with exasperation, and drove away. Each incident was a minor annoyance on its own, but together they formed a pattern of relentless, malicious harassment. She was trying to bury me in bureaucratic red tape, to make my life so miserable that I would either give in or give up and sell. My cameras captured every visit, every official vehicle pulling up to my curb. I was building a mountain of evidence. But then she crossed a line that was unforgivable. She went after my family. Or rather, the memory of it. She filed a formal complaint with the county, alleging that the small memorial garden I was building for Eleanor was a violation of local ordinances. Her complaint, which I later obtained through a public records request, was a work of fiction. She claimed it was an unstable structure and a blight on the neighborhood. This was an attack on something sacred. It was an attempt to use the weight of the county government to desecrate my wife's memory. The rage I felt was cold and pure. This was no longer a strategic game. It was personal. I knew then that simply exposing her jurisdictional overreach wasn't enough. She needed to be removed, completely and utterly. That's when the phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. "Is this Mark Ryder?" a hesitant male voice asked. "It is." "Who's this?" "You don't know me," the voice said. "My name is Frank." Frank Miller. I used to be the treasurer on the Creekwood HOA board. Before Brenda forced me out. My pulse quickened. This was it. The whistleblower. I'm listening, Frank, I said. I saw what you did at the meeting, he continued, his voice low and nervous. I saw the maps. I've known for years that she had Northwest claim on Willow Lane, but I was too scared to say anything. She's vindictive. You're telling me, I said dryly. But what she's doing now, this stuff with code enforcement, it's too much. And I know why she's so desperate to get you out. It's not just about power, Mr. Ryder. It's about money. A lot of money. He told me the whole story. A developer had been quietly trying to buy up all the properties on Willow Lane for the past 2 years. My little 5-house cul-de-sac was the last piece they needed to connect 2 larger parcels for a massive, high-density condo development. The other 4 homeowners, all elderly, had been resisting selling. Brenda made a deal with them, Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. The developer pays her a consulting fee. In exchange, she uses the HOA to harass the Willow Lane residents until they're forced to sell cheap. She's done it before, with those other houses she foreclosed on. She was supposed to deliver your block to them 6 months ago. You buying your dad's house messed up her whole timeline. It all clicked into place. The fake annex, the bogus fines, the relentless harassment, it was all a calculated plot to drive me out and clear the way for her payday. Can you prove any of this, Frank? I asked, my voice tight. I think so, he said. When I was treasurer, I made copies of some of the invoices from her brother-in-law's landscaping company. They were ridiculously inflated. And I have copies of emails between Brenda and the developer. I kept them as insurance. I never thought I'd have the guts to use them. Frank, I said, you have more guts than you think. Would you be willing to share those with me? And potentially, with the district attorney. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, weighing the risk. Finally, he said, yes. It's time someone stopped her. We arranged a discreet meeting. He handed me a thumb drive containing the final pieces of the puzzle. The evidence was damning. Emails explicitly discussing the scheme to encourage the Willow Lane residents to sell. Inflated invoices from landscaping that corresponded with large cash withdrawals from Brenda's personal bank account. A draft of a consulting agreement with the developer that promised her a 7-figure bonus once all 5 Willow Lane properties were acquired. This was no longer a civil matter. This was racketeering. It was conspiracy to commit fraud. It was extortion. The next day, I took my meticulously organized banker's box, now supplemented with Frank's explosive thumb drive, and I drove downtown. I didn't go to the local police. I didn't hire a lawyer. I went straight to the state attorney general's office, to the public corruption unit. I spent 3 hours with a sharp, no-nonsense investigator and an assistant district attorney. I laid out the entire story, from the first mailbox find to the last incriminating email. I presented my plat maps, my certified letters, the video of her threats, the financial records, and Frank's evidence. I presented it not as a victim, but as a fellow professional presenting a case study. I showed them the structure of her scheme, the load-bearing walls of fraud, and the rotten foundation of greed. When I was finished, the assistant DA leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low whistle. Mr. Ryder, he said, you've done our job for us. This is one of the most well-documented cases of HOA fraud I've ever seen. We're going to take this very seriously. My plan had worked. I had gathered the materials, drawn the blueprints, and now, I had handed them over to the demolition crew. But the DA had one final request. She's clearly an arrogant woman, he said. She thinks she's untouchable. We could just go and arrest her, but a public arrest, in the middle of her own little kingdom, that sends a message. The HOA's annual meeting is in 2 weeks, isn't it? A slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. Yes, I said. I believe it is. The final showdown was set. The night of the Creekwood Estates annual meeting felt like the air before a thunderstorm. The atmosphere in the clubhouse was thick with tension. Word had spread about the controversy. The room was packed, far more crowded than the last meeting. People weren't just here out of a sense of civic duty, they were here for the drama. They sensed something was about to break. I took a seat in the back row. Frank was a few rows ahead of me, looking pale but resolute. At the front table, Brenda presided with an air of defiant arrogance. She was wearing a bright red power suit, like a queen holding court, flanked by her nervous-looking board members. She had no idea that two plainclothes detectives from the DA's office were sitting in the row behind me, looking as bored as any other homeowner. The meeting droned on with the usual formalities. Brenda pushed through the agenda with brittle efficiency, her eyes scanning the crowd, daring anyone to challenge her. When she got to the budget portion, she announced a new, even larger special assessment for ongoing legal challenges to protect the integrity of our community. It was a direct shot at me. That was my cue. As per my arrangement with the DA's office, I stood up. "A question for the board," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silent room. Brenda's eyes locked onto mine, full of hate. "You are not a member. You will not speak. I think your members would be very interested in the nature of these legal challenges," I said, walking slowly toward the front. "They might also be interested in where, exactly, their money has been going for the last 5 years. He's out of order." Brenda shrieked, banging her gavel. "Someone call security." "That won't be necessary," a calm voice said from the back. One of the detectives stood up, holding his badge. "Let the men speak." A wave of shock and confusion washed over the room. Brenda stared at the badge, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The color drained from her face. I reached the front of the room and turned to face the assembled homeowners. An LCD projector and screen had been set up for the budget presentation. I pulled a USB stick from my pocket and plugged it into the laptop on the table. "If I may," I said to the terrified-looking board member sitting there. He nodded numbly. The first image I projected was the side-by-side plat maps. As I demonstrated at the last meeting, I began, my voice steady and methodical. "The claim that the Creekwood HOA has any jurisdiction over the properties on Willow Lane is a legal fiction. A lie. There is no annexation. There has never been an annexation." I clicked to the next slide. It was a still frame from my security camera footage, showing Brenda on my porch, her face twisted in rage. I played the audio clip. Her voice filled the room, clear and damning. "I'm going to own this house. You'll be begging to leave by the time I'm done with you." Gasps echoed through the clubhouse. "This wasn't about a mailbox," I continued, my voice cold as steel. "This was never about property values. This was about a coordinated, criminal effort to harass me and my neighbors into selling our homes." Click. The next slide showed the incorporation documents for Creekwood Development Partners, with her husband's name clearly listed. Click. The next slide showed the deeds for the 4 foreclosed homes that company had bought at auction. I could see the homeowners connecting the dots. Their whispers grew into angry murmurs. But how was this scheme funded? I asked rhetorically. Click. I brought up the invoices from Landscaping, LLC. For 5 years, your board president has been funneling your dues into her own family's pockets through no-bid contracts for her brother-in-law's company, for amounts grossly inflated above market rate. Frank stood up from his seat in the audience. "It's true," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I was the treasurer. I saw it happening. When I questioned it, she forced me off the board." The final slide was the most damning. It was the email from the developer, the one Frank had provided. I highlighted the key line: "Once all 5 Willow Lane properties are secured, your 7-figure success fee will be paid out." The room erupted. The facade of community order shattered completely. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Brenda. They weren't just angry about the money, they were furious at the betrayal. She had used their trust, their money, and their community as a weapon for her own enrichment. Brenda just sat there, frozen, her face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. The world she had so carefully constructed, the little empire of fear and control, had been systematically dismantled before her very eyes, using nothing but facts and her own words. Then, the dam of her composure broke. She leaped to her feet, her eyes wild. "Lies. All of it. He's a liar. He faked all of it. You can't prove anything," she screamed, her voice a raw, hysterical shriek. She was incriminating herself with every denial. That's when the 2 detectives moved. They walked calmly to the front of the room. Brenda from, the lead detective said, his voice cutting through the noise. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and embezzlement. The moment he said, under arrest, something inside her snapped. She lunged, not at the detectives, but at the laptop, trying to smash it. The other detective intercepted her easily, spinning her around and cuffing her hands behind her back. The public meltdown was complete. The queen was deposed, not in a quiet palace coup, but in a loud, humiliating spectacle in front of all her subjects. As they led her, sobbing and struggling, through the stunned crowd, her eyes found mine. The hatred in them was pure and undiluted. You'll regret this, she shrieked, her voice echoing in the now silent clubhouse. I'll own you. You'll never be safe. It was her final, impotent threat. A hollow echo from a collapsed kingdom. I just stood there, watching them put her in the back of an unmarked car. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a profound sense of quiet. The noise was finally over. The structure had been brought down, and order was restored. In the days and weeks that followed Brenda's spectacular downfall, a sense of liberation swept through Creekwood Estates. It was as if a long, low-grade fever had broken. The community, freed from her tyrannical reign, began to heal. An interim board was appointed, led by Frank Miller, who was hailed as a hero. Their first act was to formally issue a resolution acknowledging that the HOA had zero jurisdiction over Willow Lane. They voided every fine Brenda had ever issued against me and sent a formal, written apology. The subsequent investigation unraveled Brenda's entire criminal enterprise. Her husband and brother-in-law were also charged. The developer she was in league with quickly settled with the state to avoid prosecution, and the 4 homes that had been fraudulently foreclosed upon were eventually returned to their original owners or their families through a massive civil suit. The community, now fully aware of the corruption they had been living under, voted to completely overhaul the HOA's bylaws, instituting strict transparency rules and term limits. The beige tyranny was over. As for Brenda, she faced the full consequences of her actions. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. She was convicted on multiple felony counts, including racketeering and grand larceny. The judge, citing her predatory targeting of the elderly and her complete lack of remorse, sentenced her to 10 years in state prison. Her assets were seized to pay restitution to the HOA and the families she had victimized. She lost everything, her power, her money, her reputation, and her freedom. It was a complete and total ruin, a perfect example of poetic justice. The woman who tried to build an empire by stealing other people's homes ended up losing her own. I became something of a reluctant local legend. The HOA Slayer, one of the neighbors jokingly called me. But I never saw myself as a hero. I was just a man who wanted to be left alone to build his wife's garden. I had been pushed into a war I didn't want, but it was a war I was uniquely qualified to fight. My entire life had been about understanding systems, structures, and the lines that define them. Brenda's corrupt HOA was just another poorly designed structure with a faulty foundation. I just did what any good engineer would do. I identified the stress points, applied pressure, and watched it collapse under the weight of its own corruption. It's funny how things work out. My quest for peace had led me through a storm of conflict. But in the end, by standing up to a bully, I had brought a more profound and lasting peace not just to myself, but to an entire community. It taught me that sometimes, the only way to protect your sanctuary is to be willing to fight for its borders. The seasons turned. I finished Eleanor's garden. The heirloom roses, replanted and thriving, bloomed in a riot of color. The climbing jasmine wound its way up the trellis I built, its sweet scent filling the evening air. My little half-acre on Willow Lane was quiet again. It was the sanctuary I had sought, earned through a battle I never expected. Sometimes, I sit on my back porch in the evenings, looking at the garden she designed and I built, a glass of iced tea in my hand. The houses of Creekwood Estates are visible over the trees, but they no longer feel like a threat. They're just homes, filled with neighbors who now wave when I drive by. The line between our properties is clear, respected, and peaceful. And I finally have the quiet life I came here for. I finally have my peace.